Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Truth is Justice. A couple of days ago, a member of our Facebook group asked an excellent question. What is the ultimate purpose of Truth is Justice? Now, we spent a lot of time thinking about the answer to that question in the early stages of this project, and the answer we arrived at remains something we refer back to every day, and we use it as a guide to what we do. The short answer to the question is, we want to correct false and misleading statements. We believe that there is currently no other effective public means of doing so, at least in a way which is specific, a way which has longevity and structure that allows us to respond to those statements quickly. Of course, there are various Facebook groups directly attached to shows like that of Mr Bob Ruff's, but from my experience and the experience of those that I've spoken to, as soon as you attempt to address any of the misleading statements in those forums, you're often silenced, either through intimidation or through your simple removal from the page. Now, the longer answer. Shows like those presented by Bob suggest that their methods and that their approach to cases is, in various ways, positively influencing changes to the overall justice system. They, and others with similar shows, argue that the entire system, from law enforcement to paramedics to experts in relevant forensic fields to the legal teams, which is almost entirely on the prosecution side, but occasionally the defence if it suits their argument, to the jurors, to the judiciary, etc., etc., they argue that they're all inherently corrupt and that they are all part of a broader conspiracy directed at those that have been convicted of brutal crimes. We're not talking here about the suggestion of 1 or 2 or 3 bad eggs. It's suggested by shows like Bob's that the majority of those people involved in the prosecution of a case are actually conspiring to convict people who are innocent of crimes. Despite and entirely irrespective of the publicly stated premise of these shows, in the end they are a business, and their goal is to make a profit. And they make money through the sponsorship of products, through requesting direct financial contributions from their audience through websites like Patreon, and by aligning their shows and their publicly stated goal with professional organisations, with the purpose being to receive funding from those organisations. During various interviews, Bob has been quite open about the fact that his show is a business. It's designed to make money. And that isn't necessarily a problem on its own, but it does present some huge conflicts that are incredibly difficult to balance. A serious problem with Bob's show specifically is that it is built upon a framework of false and misleading statements. It involves only the partial release of information which suits a given narrative or a given argument at the time. And there's a real focus on entertainment through the creation of villains. Now, those villains are never the convicted person or persons, mind you. And there's a broad theme of conspiracy which flows from the lowest levels to the very highest levels of the criminal justice system. Bob relies heavily on significant portions of his audience not questioning the statements he makes, and in following his guidance without applying any independent thought at all. Others have described Bob's show as creating a cult-like atmosphere amongst his followers. Now, I believe that's a pretty accurate description. We see the audience collectively referred to as an army. There are regular references in the connected forums to Bob being referred to as Dad. There's even been the promotion of the purchase of candles, which have been adorned with artwork which depicts Bob as a religious figure. A strong charisma and a powerful expression of the goal of doing good, combined with the ability to engage people, is an extraordinarily powerful combination. And again, it needn't necessarily be a bad thing. It can be used to do some great work, but that takes care, takes professionalism, and it takes a certain level of honesty, which I don't believe we see in shows like Bob's. In my opinion, many of these shows dramatically overstate the impact they are having and that they can have on the justice system. Despite that, they can have, and many of them are having, a dramatic impact on the perception that individuals have of the justice system and of all the various actors within it. The suggestions of a widespread conspiracy are so frequently drummed into the audiences of these shows that many of the audience members have even commented on how, purely as a result of the influence of these shows, that they are now bringing up their children to distrust the police. Actually, not just the police, law enforcement generally, and investigators and various expert technicians and the courts and lawyers, though not all lawyers, mind you, specifically prosecution lawyers. Defence lawyers are the one group that are largely tolerated, and the bulk of which are exempt from these cries of conspiracy. Shows like these can and do have a dramatic negative impact on individuals, normal, everyday individuals. Bob even encourages his audience to take direct damaging action towards specific individuals on the basis of false and misleading statements, really. Situations where the experts in their fields who have a different educated and experience-driven view that is simply different to his. This approach can have potentially disastrous consequences for those who are attacked, but it can also have terrible consequences for those following Bob's guidance in launching them. From my knowledge of the people launching these attacks, and in many cases from their own admissions, it appears that they haven't even taken the time to review all of the material associated with the case. Mostly they've relied entirely on the material fed to them by Bob, which is incredibly dangerous. Now, can the false and misleading statements that are being made be challenged in a way which effectively counters the pace and exposure that Bob and others distribute them? We truly hope so, and that's our definite goal. We believe that if we can show just one person that the statements being made by some of these shows are incorrect, and we can pull the curtain back just a little bit, then we've achieved some success and our efforts are worthwhile. Others have mentioned the importance of certain professional groups, specifically those which have been the focus of attacks by Bob and others, becoming visible and providing an effective public challenge to the statements being made by shows like the one hosted by Bob. Now, if we can encourage that process, and if those groups start to correct some of those statements being made, and even if we're able to provide a forum for them to do so, then we will be entirely achieving what we set out to do. This episode begins our process of addressing those false and misleading statements, and we shine a light on the questionable ways in which shows like Bob's tend to operate. On the 12th of August this year, on episode 603, Bob spoke with Ms. Colleen Barnett, the prosecutor who tried Sandra's case. The episode lasted for about 50 minutes, with Ms. Barnett speaking for about 30 minutes of that. Now, it's been repeatedly stated how this interview represented the entire case for the state. Everything condensed down into that block of time. The tens of thousands of words that comprise the transcripts, the massive number of exhibits which were presented at trial, the many thousands of hours that went into every element of the case by dozens of people who were directly involved in it, over 24 witnesses who gave testimony during the trial. Now, it's suggested, and often referred to, that this was it for the state. This was all they had. Aside from the mere fact that, despite suggestions to the contrary, Ms. Barnett certainly didn't have any obligation or any need to try and convince anyone of anything during that episode. To suggest that she would somehow be able to condense all of the case material into a 30-minute block is absolutely ludicrous, and it points to a massive lack of understanding or a deliberate misrepresentation of the way in which the court system, trials, and the justice system generally operate. Do I believe that Bob was of the opinion that a case from one side could be condensed into such a tiny block of time? No, definitely not. Bob is well and truly aware of the amount of material that comprises this case, and others like it, and he knows exactly how much preparation goes into a trial, especially into a murder trial. No, I believe there's a very deliberate process which is undertaken by Bob and his show, and the invitation to Ms. Barnett and her appearance on the show were important elements in that process. And this isn't just restricted to Ms. Barnett. Others have been the focus of this approach, including Mr. Carpenter, Ms. Rossi, and the jury foreman. The entire process is designed to achieve a number of things. There's the need to frame a particular person in a particular way. Now, it's crucially important because the villain or villains represent excellent fodder for a wrongful conviction entertainment show, and they need to be someone other than the person who was actually convicted, the person who is the actual villain. Now, if they can create this villain character, and that person can be someone directly connected to their conviction, for example, the prosecutor, then they represent the absolute perfect person to frame as the villain. Having this villain provides a centre of focus for the audience to direct their anger and their aggression, and it creates an environment which leads to the easy generation of conspiracy theories. It also allows name-calling, finger-pointing, and importantly, it allows the attention to be taken entirely away from the evidence and directed towards a specific individual. And we see how that has evolved. It's become an incredibly effective tool for Bob to use, and he wields it with a level of arrogance that seems to rev up his devout followers. The establishment of this villain, though, is based on nothing. It's not based on facts, it's not based on reality, it's just based on entirely false and misleading statements. It's smoke and mirrors mostly, and it relies on people being easily swayed by comments which are misleading, and which Bob is confident will not be checked, or at least by the time they are, the villain will be so well and truly established that it no longer matters that the basis for it originally didn't even exist. I completely appreciate that when a project represents your income, as it does for Bob, and there are commercial realities at play, that those realities end up becoming your main concern. And it is in this context of wrongful convictions where that represents a massive problem. Make no mistake, some wrongful conviction shows like Bob's are in the end just a show. Bob himself describes how the person he is on the show is a character, and how he has to spend time on creating and developing different characters, being those people involved in the case, for the purposes of entertaining his audience, for the purpose of creating an entertaining show and generating drama and action and everything that goes along with that. Now, I'm not criticising that per se. There are undoubtedly many different ways in which these types of shows can make a difference and shine a light on injustice. But as I touched on in the first episode, they also have enormous responsibility. They have a responsibility to their audience, to make sure that they are aware, at least to a point, of the true underlying motives of the show, and that they don't become swept up in a wave of feelings of independent investigation, when the reality is quite different. They have a responsibility to the people directly involved in the investigation, and in the processing of the case, to manage those individuals' involvement in the show respectfully, and with professionalism. Don't forget, we're not talking about football players, or Hollywood celebrities, or reality TV stars. We're talking about people who have dedicated huge amounts of time, most of their life in some instances, to working in their chosen fields. Fields which, however you look at it, are designed to help us, as members of the public, remain safe, and to, more generally, uphold the rule of law. They also have a responsibility to the victims of the crimes, to not use their cases as a financial means to an end, but to honour them through a thorough and detailed analysis of all the material, and to maintain an open mind as to the outcome. When you set out to look at a case from a wrongful conviction perspective, the approach is doomed from the start. And that is exactly what happened here. Bob reflected at the start of the season, when someone asked him how he was going to progress through the season with a focus on the murder of Jim, when he only had limited amounts of the case material. Now, to use Bob's own words, he said the case was already locked and loaded, that he had no plan B. That gives a great insight into the approach the show takes, and what the perspective was from the beginning. It's truly shocking if you look at it from any other viewpoint than it being simply a show with a commercial financial focus. It had to air, whether the material was available or not, and it could have only had one focus from the start: pursue the wrongful conviction angle at all costs. What we are going to do on this episode is go to the origin of many of these false and misleading statements with respect to Ms Barnett, and we'll highlight and address each of those statements. We'll pull back the curtain on the approach taken by Bob to creating this villain by going back and seeing how it was all framed to begin with. We're going to start by looking at the interview with Ms Barnett, which Bob released as episode 603, and the subsequent follow-up episode 603, which addressed listener questions. It is during that follow-up episode that the process of creating the villain is firmly set in motion, as we will demonstrate. Early in the episode, Bob asks Ms Barnett to provide her thoughts on the way the media, and in particular the Dateline NBC segment, have portrayed the case. And Ms Barnett provides a very clear, balanced response, and in doing so she highlights a number of very important things. Ms Barnett notes how important it is to have access to a full and complete record, and how the trial and all the evidence are absolutely necessary to allow you, the individual, to judge for yourself. Ms Barnett's opening point is so important for us to consider, especially in the context of how the case was approached by Bob. This type of case can't be condensed down into an hour-long episode or small elements of the evidence. It requires the study of large amounts of material. And that doesn't always make for great entertainment. In fact, for many, the mere thought of reading thousands of pages of transcripts would be far from enjoyable, but it is wholly and crucially necessary to ensure you get a complete picture of the case. Of course, that information can be summarised, and that allows you to gain a certain level of understanding based on those summaries. But it's only a partial picture. It's only an understanding based on the types of summaries that you were provided with, the intention of the person that created those summaries. When you're presented with only a small part of it, well, the decision you arrive at is going to be completely guided by the information that was chosen to be shared with you. And that is exactly the situation that we have with Bob's show. There have been some absolutely ridiculous suggestions made that Ms Barnett and prosecutors generally don't need to prepare thoroughly for a case. There's the perception that the prosecutorial role involves simply reading the reports which were prepared for them and then just turning up at a trial. Obviously, those with any knowledge of trials or interaction with attorneys would know that this assessment couldn't be any further from the truth. And it's offensive, not just to the lead prosecutor or defence counsel, it's offensive to the entire court system and to everyone involved in it, including the complainants and the defendants. It's as laughable as believing that a heart surgeon would arrive at an operating theatre minutes before a procedure and then proceed to quickly read over a few notes prior to asking for the scalpel. It is simply not how it works. As we've already highlighted, there were huge numbers of exhibits in this case, hundreds and hundreds of photos, large numbers of reports written by various experts, thousands of words contained in incident reports and their accompanying supplements, audio and video footage that must be listened to and viewed, and the list goes on and on. Anyone that has thoroughly read through the transcripts of this case will understand the massive depth of knowledge Ms Barnett had with respect to all the case material. Now, for those that haven't read through the transcripts, Ms Barnett herself provided us with an indication of her commitment to understanding this case fully through her comments at approximately the 7-minute mark of episode 603 of Bob's show. At that point of the show, Ms Barnett talks about how she was able to arrange a visit to the house where the murder took place, and how she was able to walk around the house to gain an understanding of the layout and to enable her to better understand the perspective of various distances and various lines of sight which were offered. The prosecution of any case is never something that was pulled together at the last minute, and involves painstaking research and an absolutely thorough understanding of every single piece of material relevant to a given case. Now we'll move on to some of the specific statements that Ms Barnett makes during that interview and that Bob then raises in the follow-up episode that followed. At the 10-minute and 32-second mark of that episode, Ms Barnett responds to Bob's suggestion that a television was stolen from the master bedroom. And Ms Barnett does this in a way in which she provides reasons for believing that the items weren't stolen. And in my opinion, she does it in a way which highlights some of the real problems with the claims that the TV was actually stolen. During follow-up episode 603 of Bob's show at approximately the 29-minute 40-second mark, Bob notes the following in response to a comment from the co-host, Mr Mike Bussing, about the suggestion that certain items were stolen from the house. Now, to quote from Bob, "For example, she talks about the TV and made a big point there was TVs all over the house. That's true. There was I believe, a 48-inch TV, big screen TV, a 55-inch big screen TV, and an old council TV. None of those were taken, that's true. But in the bedroom was a 32-inch flat screen TV. Easy to carry, not very heavy. That was gone." End quote. Now, the reference to she in the above quote is referring to Ms Barnett. There are a few things going on here, and they come back to our earlier important point about the approach taken by Bob. Bob suggests that Ms Barnett makes a big point, and he emphasises that in a way that suggests, at least to me, that he has an issue with her comment, and that the comment is somehow and in some way wrong. But then, importantly, he immediately, but in a significantly understated way, at least compared to the previous comment, confirms that what Miss Barnett said was actually true. There were TVs throughout the house. You'll notice a particular pattern as we progress through this episode with this approach taken by Bob. And then when we go to look at the way other individuals have been treated, you'll see incredible similarities. Bob notes that in the bedroom was a 32-inch flat screen TV. Now, this is the TV that was suggested was stolen from within the master bedroom. Remember that this interview took place very early in the season, and it was prior to Bob having access to large amounts of the case material. This was at the point where he only had very limited amounts of information available to him. Mostly just the accounts given by Sandra and her daughter Elizabeth, and perhaps a number of other family members. And relying on these accounts of family members is especially true with respect to the presence of the TV in the master bedroom. Now, we have certain elements that could be suggestive of a TV or some other device being present at some point in time, or at least made to look like a device like that was present at some point in time. But it's far from a fact that it was indeed there, and to do so relies almost entirely on the recollection of individuals who, at the same time, claim to have a significantly impaired memory function. For those that haven't seen the photographs of the study on our website, and we'll provide a link to it in the show notes, we encourage you to go there and have a look at those photos. Whilst looking at the study, pay specific attention to the TV which is on the left side of one of the shots. Now, not the large TV in the middle left, the other TV on the far left. It's quite difficult to see as the photo is taken from side on, but it appears to be a flat screen TV which is sitting on a shelf. Now, this is relevant for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's another TV to add to the list of TVs in the house that Bob didn't mention, but that Ms Barnett was likely including in her statement about the number of televisions. Secondly, it's a flat screen TV, and it appears to be in the same size range described as the one which was claimed to be present in the master bedroom. Now, the point is, without all the facts and without a thorough explanation of all of the material, Bob's discussion on the TV comment in the episode following Ms Barnett's interview had one purpose. It was to begin the creation of this villain character. During follow-up episode 603 of Bob's show, at approximately the 11-minute 55-second mark, Bob notes the following in response to a question asked by a listener about whether Sandra had any injuries. To quote Bob, "So here's a first bit of evidence that might lean you the other way. And the answer to the question is, Sandy Melgar didn't have a mark on her. The best they could come up with is she had a tiny, tiny scratch on one of her fingers, and I'm talking a scratch like a paper cut that was days old on one of her fingers. Other than that, not a mark on her, not a bruise, other than the bruises on her arm that looked like they were from the bindings, and her ankles." The they that Bob refers to in the passage appears to be directed at the prosecution, and the message he's sending is clear. It sets up the prosecution team as the enemy. Now, it's an interesting statement to consider, and it highlights to us a number of things. Firstly, it demonstrates how little information Bob actually had at the time of recording this episode, and how descriptions of his injuries have changed significantly since that episode to now include such things as the black eye, a suggested traumatic brain injury that Sandra had suffered, the bruising on Sandra's upper arms, which don't appear to have any connection to the actual bindings, And we also have this mysterious suggestion by Bob of Sandra's ankles. There's no reference to anything further, just the inclusion of the ankles in a comment about the bruises on Sandra's arms and the bindings. It's creating a picture. It's framing the story, creating the enemy and the villain. But significantly, this is being done with very little actual factual information at hand. But like Bob said, this season was locked and loaded. He had no plan B. During follow-up episode 603 of Bob's show, at approximately the 21-minute, 58-second mark, Bob notes the following in response to a question asked by a listener about the suggested sexual activity on the night of the murder. To quote Bob, "Again, this was another, in my opinion, kind of a mischaracterization or misrepresentation of that evidence. When she said, you know they were, I don't know if she said the words hidden under a pillow, but she certainly said that sex toys were under the pillow. Well, they were in fact under a pillow, but they were not under a pillow in the way you might suppose. So, like I pictured, I'm sure you heard me sounding a little bit surprised when she said that there was like these sex toys up, like the bed's made and they were under the pillow. It wasn't the case. They were down more towards the foot of the bed." The reference to she in that quote is referring to Ms. Barnett. Now, the statement made by Bob is made in such a way that seeks to suggest that Ms. Barnett somehow misrepresented the evidence due to a statement that she made suggesting that the pouch of sex toys was found under a pillow. Now, Bob goes on to confirm the validity of that very statement made by Ms. Barnett in the very next sentence. But the fact that the statement by Ms. Barnett was completely accurate doesn't matter at all to Bob. The thing he would like his audience to take away from that exchange is that Ms. Barnett was in some way misrepresenting the evidence. Another element of the villain character has been created, entirely out of thin air. During follow-up episode 603 of Bob's show, at approximately the 26-minute, 10-second mark, Bob notes the following in response to a question asked by a listener about the knife. To quote Bob, "She said like 6 inches, but I think you're talking like an 8 or a 9-inch blade." Now, the reference to she in the above quote is referring to Ms. Barnett. This is yet another quite remarkable statement made by Bob, but which very clearly highlights our point. We encourage you to listen to the statement by Bob if you get the opportunity, and pay close attention to the way that it is spoken. The comment by Bob seeks to entirely dismiss Ms. Barnett's statement on the size of the blade. It's intended to create the impression for his audience that Ms. Barnett had no idea about the murder weapon, and that Bob is the one his audience should rely on for those types of things. Another element of the villain has now been created, and again it's based on nothing, just a false statement, which everyone now obviously knows that the knife was 6 inches, exactly as Ms. Barnett stated, and exactly as should have been expected given her knowledge of the case. Now, at this point, it's important to reiterate a point we made earlier. There are instances where comments like that above are resolved through information being made available at a later date, or where earlier statements by Bob are proven to be incorrect. What we don't see, though, is an apology or any form of retraction. The known information is stated and the show simply moves on. There's likely the anticipation that the audience will not recall the earlier false statement made by Bob, but you can almost guarantee that they do recall the message that was sent, the message that the person being discussed is a villain and that they shouldn't be trusted. During follow-up episode 603 of Bob's show, at approximately the 34-minute, 22-second mark, Bob notes the following in response to a comment from the co-host about the suggestion by Ms. Barnett that Sandra could see the closet from the jacuzzi. And to quote Bob, "Again, I started to point out to her that maybe in a perfect scenario you could see there, but first of all, you heard her say, if you look over your right shoulder. So the position Sandy said she was sitting in, first of all, was facing the exact opposite direction. So if you were looking at a map, so Sandy is sitting with her back to the crime scene and pointed completely away from it. If she turned around over her right shoulder and looked almost 180 degrees behind her, she would be pointing in that direction. But I don't see it. I need to get the full actual 2-scale diagrams. I don't see how there's an angle where you can see that closet at all." The word her in the above quote is referring to Ms. Barnett. Now, of all the statements we've highlighted in this episode, this is by far the most audacious. During episode 603, Ms. Barnett noted at approximately the 7-minute mark of that interview that she had had the opportunity to walk through the house and observe the different features, perspective of the rooms and the lines of sight which were available. Ms. Barnett had been to the house and had witnessed this with her own eyes, yet extraordinarily, the comments from Bob that we just read entirely dismissed the factual and very accurate account of Ms. Barnett. In its place, Bob offers up his own interpretation of what could be seen from the jacuzzi, based on maybe just a floor layout, and it was entirely wrong, completely and utterly false. But it had a purpose. It suited the narrative. It suited the story that Bob wanted to present. Now, many of you that have visited our website or are participating in our Facebook page will have seen the photograph that was taken that shows the line of sight from the jacuzzi to the master bedroom closet. We'll put up a link to that photograph in the show notes. When you look at that photo, consider a few of Bob's comments, which were that Sandra was facing in the exact opposite direction to the master bedroom closet, and that it would take her turning almost 180 degrees to have a line of sight of the closet. Now, when you look at the photograph, if you haven't looked at it already, and you consider those statements from Bob, think a little bit about the motivation behind him making those comments. I mean, the statements are very clearly wrong. They're very clearly misleading, but think about why he made those statements. Now, with those comments from Bob, the creation of the villain was almost complete. At least the grounding for it was well and truly established. And it had been achieved only through false and misleading statements. It would be built on over episodes that were to follow, and it would continue through the season, right up to the latest episode, episode 18. Next week, on Truth is Justice, we will continue progressing through the season to specifically address the many false and misleading statements that have been made about Ms. Barnett and others. We look forward to you joining us then, as we continue to set the record straight.